walking virtually along the world's most revered footpaths and connecting the global community of pilgrims. It's the Sacred Steps Podcast. Available on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Broadcasting from the Shea Mare Studios in Florida. Here's your host, Pilgrim backpacker and author, Kevin Donahue.
Buen Camino, Pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps Podcast. If you're joining us for the very first time, Buen Camino, welcome to the program. I'm Kevin Donahue, Pilgrim, backpacker, and author of the Pilgrim's Table and Sacred Steps, a Pilgrimage Journey. On this podcast, we're walking virtually alongside pilgrims and authors, sharing their stories and connecting a community of pilgrims from around the world. I cannot wait to share today's episode with you and welcome back my friend, English author Joe Francis Penn. For those of you who have followed the podcast for a few seasons, you'll remember Joe joined us in season 2 as a distance walker to talk about her first ever pilgrimage journey on one of my routes, England's Pilgrim's Way from London to Canterbury. Today, we're discussing Joe's first ever Camino on the Portuguese route, and I can't wait to hear her insights and her reflections. Before we begin, let's open up that mailbag and answer some of your email. I'd like to start with a message that comes from Jessica, a pilgrim in South Africa. She writes, Kevin, I'm planning my first Camino in 2023, and I'm overwhelmed by all of the gear suggestions and options. I want to feel that I am prepared, but at times it's all a bit too much, which has drained a bit of the excitement from my experience. What advice do you have for someone who is trying to prepare a packing list for the Camino de Santiago? Buen Camino, Jessica. Thanks for the email, Jessica. First, preparing for a Camino shouldn't be overwhelming, and I'm sorry that you're experiencing those emotions. I tend to be a bit of an over-preparer, an over-researcher, someone who's way too deep in the weeds of all of the details, especially when it comes to gear, because that's certainly something that's within my control. So I know what you mean when you say it can be a bit too much, and I don't want you to have that sense of emotion. I want you to regain that excitement. I'm a bit in the same situation. I'm preparing to walk the Camino de Santiago again for the first time since 2019, and I'm wondering what's changed. So I'm going to devote an upcoming episode to preparing my packing list and planning for the Camino de Santiago. That will happen this spring, so hopefully a bit before your journey. Hopefully you could take some of those lessons and apply them to your Camino. For my experience, I'm going to be walking with my teenage son, Jack, and as a dad, well, first as a pilgrim, I have my kit dialed in. I know exactly what I want to take, but as a dad, what does he need? How will it be different for him? And not every piece of gear works for every pilgrim. So the personalization and individualization is a very important aspect that I want to get into on an upcoming episode. Right away, if you're preparing for your Camino de Santiago, I have a number of packing lists on my blog at onestepthenanother.com. So you can go there and hopefully gain some insights. From a gear perspective, I have some men's gear suggestion and the counterpart for women's gear. Women's specific gear, Jessica, is very important because the fitment is different. Also, gear companies are finally recognizing that all of us look different. So there are gear choices that are for people who are more petite and people who are plus size, like me. I'm carrying a little extra. So make sure that you're making the right choices as you evaluate those. For your first Camino, we also have a YouTube playlist called Camino 101, answering basic questions about your very first Camino. You'll find that at youtube.com/ Sacred Steps. I'll link all of those in the show notes below, Jessica, so that you can use those as a resource for planning your very first Camino and hopefully helping you feel a little less overwhelmed by so many options. Lastly, I'd really like to do a live stream. So, Jessica, if you wouldn't mind joining us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram for a live stream prior to my Camino Portuguese, I would love to answer any last questions. I'm also going to be sharing my kit exactly, down to the undergarments, down to the nail clippers, everything that I'm packing for my 2023 Camino Santiago. So I hope you'll join us, Jessica, but most importantly, buen camino. I hope you find the joy in this experience and are able to transition from some of the anxiety of what you're packing to some of the focus on what you want to get out of your Camino, Jessica. Buen Camino to you and to all of our friends and fans in South Africa. If you'd like to share your comments, thoughts, or plans for your upcoming Camino, head over to the website at sacredstepspodcast.com, tap the send a voicemail button on your phone, tablet, or computer, and you can send your recorded message. We may share it on an upcoming episode. I mentioned our Sacred Steps YouTube channel, youtube.com/sacred steps. The Camino 101 playlist is really a great resource. I'm going to be adding some new videos to that as well this spring, but short 3 to 5 minute videos answering your most common questions about which Camino route to walk, what should you budget, where do you sleep, what is an albergue, what to pack, and really, best apps for your phone. Simple questions in short video form at youtube.com/sacred steps. English author Jo Frances Penn returns to the podcast today to discuss her 3 pilgrimage walks: the Pilgrim's Way from London to Canterbury, the Way of St. Cuthbert from Melrose Abbey to the Holy Island of Lindisfarne, and her Camino Portuguese, as well as a brand new book that she's got coming out this spring, Pilgrimage: Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways. Jo was kind enough to have me on her Books and Travel podcast a few months ago, and I find the intersection of our journeys, Jo's and mine, our shared experiences of walking 3 of the same routes, has created a bit of a connection that I feel and I really appreciate with Jo. Her new book is unlike anything she's ever done. Jo's focus primarily has been on writing almost 40 fiction thrillers and a series of books for writers. And this new book is a very personal look at pilgrimage, both as a journey and as an opportunity for growth and discovery. The book is Pilgrimage: Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways. And my guest today is my friend, Jo Frances Penn. Jo Frances Penn, welcome back to the Sacred Steps podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me back on the show, Kevin. It's great to be here.
I was just telling everyone in the intro how excited I am to have you back. Season 2, everyone was excited to hear about your walks in the UK and then how they overlap some of my walks. And now you've recently completed your first Camino de Santiago on the Camino Portuguese. So you've been busy.
Well, of course, this has been over 2.5 years of journeys. And in fact, I guess one of the first lessons I've learned is that we might think that one pilgrimage is enough. But then it turns out that the lessons of pilgrimage may take some time to emerge. And though we thought one journey was it, maybe our journey is longer than one pilgrimage. And I really felt, for me, the 3 walks that I did, the Pilgrim's Way, St. Cuthbert's Way, and the Camino de Santiago, together, they almost formed one journey, one arc in my life over a midlife period. And I know you're turning 50 soon, and it's like these periods.
Wait till you get to be my age, Jo.
I'm only a few years behind you, but I feel like the search of midlife is also reflected in these pilgrimages. So yeah, it feels of course, in the world, things have been very difficult the last few years, but yeah, the 3 pilgrimages together, even though if you count the number of days, they might not even have been that much in the grand scheme of things, they represent quite a shift.
Well, and that's always been something that a lot of pilgrims talk about. Hey, I just finished. Maybe they just arrive in Santiago de Compostela, and then they get out the book and they say, where am I going to go next, right? Because there's something about the simple life of pilgrimage that has such a lure in contrast to the day-to-day lives of many of us who, you get up and you're commuting and you're going into an office and this, that, and the other. So it is such a divergence from the day-to-day, but also an opportunity to experience a different side of yourself. And that's really what you and I have talked about on our podcast. You were kind enough to have me on the Books and Travel podcast. So that's linked down below in the show notes, along with all of Joe Francis's many websites and prolific books. Today, we're going to be talking about a new book that is going to hit this week. So I am there it is. I'm looking forward to highlighting her new book, Pilgrimage. But before we get into it, I do want to go into the Camino de Santiago, because when we first talked, you were very much an ultra distance walker. You did these insane 50K walks a day and all of that, and you were getting into hiking and backpacking, doing the Pilgrim's Way. You shared with us the story of your walk from London to Canterbury, and you were working towards, you said, I want to do the Camino de Santiago. And now you've done the Camino Portuguese. So I'd love to hear a little bit about it. Tell us about your route on the Camino Portuguese.
Well, first of all, I had always thought I would do the Frances route. So, across northern Spain, southern France, northern Spain, I thought that's what I would do. Those are all the books are about that route.
Of course.
And when I practically looked at booking it, and this is a tip for people as well, at some point you have to book your pilgrimage. You have to book your time off. You have to book the flights. You have to book accommodation or with a company. And when I looked at it, I realized that I couldn't take 6 weeks off my business. And so I looked at the other routes, and the Ingles, of course, I'm English, the Ingles would have made sense, but it was too short. And then I looked at the Portuguese coastal route, which goes from Porto in Portugal, which is fantastic. And if people go that way, you must have a few days in Porto. And I think that's where you need to have a drink too, because it's obviously famous for port. And then you go north up the coast, and then you go slightly inland. You cross over into Spain, and then you go inland. So, and it's a much quieter route. And I guess I didn't really realize how busy the Camino routes can be. But the Portuguese coastal is quieter. So I wanted to kind of say that to people. Even if you've thought for 2 decades that you're going to walk a specific route and you're going to walk through the towns you read about in other people's books, it may be that you change your mind, but the experience of pilgrimage is still worthwhile. So don't be fixated on one particular route. I feel like pilgrimage is about the start and the finish and the journey, but I really didn't expect to change my mind like that, but I loved that route. There were lots of wonderful places. Portugal's wonderful in itself, much cheaper than Spain, by the way. So like you get an espresso for under €1, which was great. Some of the best wine in the world in that region, Albarino, a lot of wonderful seafood along the route, views of the ocean, walking next to the ocean a lot of the time, which you don't get on that French route, obviously, because it's mostly inland, or all inland, I think. So I feel like the route, there were a couple of sort of places that were, well, there was all historical, lots of ancient churches. Obviously, these are all pilgrim routes, all converging. I mean, I'm sure you've got maps on your website of all the different routes that there are to Santiago de Compostela. So it was 14 days. That was back to back walking. There was a couple of bigger days of like 35 kilometers, but mostly between sort of 15 and 22. The weather was generally a little bit too hot for me. Some storms, one particular day when
said the English lady.
Yeah, massive storm came in. Yeah, but when you walk that Camino route, you have in your mind that it's much more warm and pleasant weather.
Oh, absolutely. They call it the coastal route for a reason, right? So
Yeah.
I did the Portuguese in 2019, and little known, well disclosed topic on the podcast is that I'm going back to the Portuguese.
You're doing the same
this
one
year, 2023, in June with my son Jack. So I'll be 50. Jack will be 14. So we're going to spend some time. I don't know how much port we're going to get into, but I promise you we'll get into some of these routes you're describing for sure. So you were a solo pilgrim, right? So you embarked on this journey by yourself, much like your other pilgrimages. You did the Pilgrim's Way from London to Canterbury solo. You walked from Melrose Abbey on the Scottish border to Lindisfarne, Holy Island, solo pilgrimage. And then you ended up in Porto to begin a Camino de Santiago as a solo female pilgrim. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so I think we all have these rules as to what pilgrimage means.
Mm-hmm.
And along with the spiritual side, the historic places, which I know you also think are important part of the route.
Yeah.
I also had a rule, which was I walk solo and I carry my own pack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was a life challenge where I needed to feel resilience around myself as an individual woman.
Mm.
And so part of that challenge was, well, even though you don't need massive navigation skills on these routes because there are so many waymarkers, parts of the St. Cuthberts, I got lost. On the Pilgrims, I did get lost a little bit, but it was like there were things that you have to do as a solo pilgrim that you don't when you're in a group. So when you're in a group, you don't necessarily meet people outside your group because you're in your group. Whereas as a solo pilgrim, I met lots of people on the way, people always stopping to say hi, or you can meet people in the accommodation, or and then they would walk on, or you would walk on, and it was much more, well, we're just passing, pilgrims passing, lots of buen camino and moving on. And I needed that. I'm an introvert. I love being on my own. I take a lot of photos and I walk quite slowly uphill. So I got to walk my own pace. I got to take whatever photos I wanted. I could rest when I wanted. And I feel I just didn't want a group experience. I wanted a solo experience. And there was also part of me around, well, let's talk about religion. For example, there are places where people think, oh, this is a spiritual place. Therefore, we will stop here and we will have a spiritual moment.
Here comes the place in the guidebook where we have spiritual at 2:30 p.m. Okay, got it, on the schedule.
Yeah, and I felt that there were the places that I felt most spiritual were the places that possibly other people wouldn't. Although I was going to ask you, actually, probably one of the highlights of my whole 3 pilgrimages was walking across the sands from, across to Lindisfarne, Holy Island. And that day the seals were singing and it was just a moment out of time. So I was going to ask you, like, how was that crossing for you? Because for me, it really was a super highlight.
Yeah. People have made the comment that I have like a podcast crush on you because there's so much about our journeys that are completely aligned. I like to walk as a solo pilgrim. I've done all of my walks as a solo pilgrim. And for me, it's the same reasons. I need this headspace. I need it to be okay if I'm not okay right now and can't be social with you at the moment. And I need it to be okay if I want to rest, or I want to sit down, or I want to move on. So there's a lot of that. And to your point, doing it on your own has a certain sense of accomplishment. There's a test, there's a challenge involved in some of that. And that resonates with me. But yes, you and I have done, those are 3 walks that we have in common. And of the 3, the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury, the St. Cuthbert's Way arriving on Holy Island, and the Camino Portuguese, nothing compares to walking to Holy Island across the sands. I've walked now to Rome on the Via Francigena this past summer. I've walked to some of the California missions, and nothing brought me closer to my faith and gave me a sense of connection the way that the walk across the sands to Holy Island did. Absolutely. That was, for me, one of the defining moments of doing any of these walks.
Yeah, and I really think that there are some places where I say the veil is thin, and where you could almost step through to medieval times, and there would be St. Cuthbert and the monks walking across there, or there have been people on that island since, I don't know, thousands of years. And you think that people have crossed there for faith, for living. And what I love about these tidal places is you cannot control the tides. So either you cross and you make it, or there's these little huts you remember on stilts where people do. In fact, just recently, there's been people having to get into those huts because the tide comes in. And there's something about being cut off and in solitude. Obviously, St. Cuthbert was, a monk, and he loved his solitude. And so this moment standing in the middle of where the tide is going to rush through in not very long, you feel so human, and yet you also get that perspective of being one in a very long line of pilgrims stretching back for thousands of years. And I love that perspective. I love the perspective of one day I will be gone, my footsteps are washed away, and this will still be here. And of course, the bird life, that's actually a sanctuary. And so the bird life there's so much life around you. And with the seals, you just think, yeah, humans can disappear and this will still be here. And that is marvelous. And that, I think, whether you're specifically religious or Christian, or just, for me, a person who is spiritual, it's a very special place. And I don't know, do you think, because you didn't walk the whole route, you did less of the route, and I kind of felt like I was also very, very tired. There was a moment where my physical self was kind of broken anyway, and that almost helps you be open to the divine in some way. Like, how is your experience of being super tired and broken and experiencing God?
Yeah. First of all, I think I'm supposed to be asking you all these great questions because
it's a discussion.
But so when I went up to do the last sections of the St. Cuthbert's Way, it was because I was intending, I went from London to Canterbury and then Canterbury to Dover. And then at the time, because of the dreaded COVID, right, you couldn't put passengers on the Dover ferry to go to France. And so I had this opportunity in the moment to go up to do the St. Cuthbert. But watching the tides, and living in Florida, we love our tides, right? But watching the tides and thinking about all of the pilgrims and all of the brothers who had walked across to the Abbey over, as you said, 1,000 years, right? And you don't see any of their footsteps, right? Because the tides have swept the sands. And it's a great reminder of how finite our time is. So I think it's a place that puts you into a very reflective space. But yeah, I mean, I think we talked about how being tired is one of the gifts of pilgrimage, because for me, I am very aware, especially in the morning, of everything that I'm doing as I'm walking, right? You're taking this picture and you're being careful about your foot placement, and here's a puddle and and through the heat of the day or the length of the walk or the sleep or lack of that you got the night before, the body tends to do this physical aspect of you're just in motion. And that fatigue, I find, really creates a really quiet space for me where I'm no longer thinking about the act of walking. It creates that headspace for me, the fatigue, where I'm actually being more introspective, and I'm aware that I'm tired. I'm aware that I'm, on this journey. And those are usually my most reflective moments. And they happen, as you said, in the strangest places. You talked about in our last podcast about this is not I checked. This is not in the UK travel promotion, but you talked about being at Crayford Ness, which is not the, it's a beautiful place, but if you turn around, it is less picturesque. And you talked about being in a place where you felt a connection unexpectedly to spirituality. As you said, the veil is thin.
Yeah. And that particular place, again, that was a day I'd walked 40K that day. It was meant to be 2 days.
Which is insane.
Yeah, it was a bit. It was
Let's not
45 by the end of the day. But at that point, I was so broken, and it was horrible, like not very nice area, I should say, really not, a bit industrial. And you walk out of this industrial park onto this, again, it's a tidal place. I think these tidal places are so powerful, but there's a fossilized Neolithic forest where these spars of wood kind of come out of the water, and then across the way is a nature reserve. And yeah, I had that moment of sort of looking out over the Thames estuary with this flock of Canada geese coming overhead, looking at this ancient forest and having a moment of, that forest once had birds singing in, like the birds that are singing around me now. There were skylarks as well singing. And again, they will be here when I'm gone. And this sense of memento mori, remember you shall die, I find very helpful in life, because it does mean that, for example, there are people listening to this right now who have always said, I want to walk the Camino. And as I did for 20 years, and who have not walked it, or who have a goal that they just will, one day I will do that. And I can't remember when we recorded, but I had very bad COVID. And it was when I was lying in bed for a couple of weeks going, I always said I would do the Camino de Santiago. And what if I die now? Or what if I never get better? What if I can never walk this? And there was that moment of realizing that there will be a point where I cannot walk that way, where I cannot even walk 5 kilometers, let alone 45. So I have to make the most of my life right now and take that moment of making it happen. And look, both of us know how hard it is. You know, you have to make space in your life for this. And yet both of us and everyone you've talked to on this show, this has been life-changing moments that happen when you take time out of your normal life. And the physical suffering of, and I had quite a lot of suffering, to be honest. Like I feel like
I think that's okay to say. A lot of people don't say that, and I keep repeating it, that, you know, it's there's a lot of rainbows, but there are some dark clouds at times. Metaphorically, it's not all unicorns and rainbows on some of these walks.
Well, in fact, I would say mostly mine was not unicorns and rainbows, but I feel like the suffering part of it, whether the physical, but also I was going through quite a lot of mental health issues. And that's what's difficult about a travel memoir. I guess the upshot is people do not go on pilgrimage unless they have something to sort out in their life. Literally, people generally go on pilgrimage when they have a question to answer, or they're going through grief, or they're midlife like we are, or they're going through some kind of change. They might not even know what that change is yet, but they feel a call to pilgrimage. And that call is something you have to heed, because it's going to keep coming back over and over again. And in the book, I talk about starting energy, and starting energy is the energy you need before you even get to the beginning. And that starting energy is the thing that will help you book it, will help you take time off your work, will help you save. For example, if you're coming from America to Europe, you're going to have to save some money, get fit, prepare for all the things. Although I would say I'm quite I am a normal person. I'm not like a super, amazing.
You're pretty
ultra.
amazing.
You mentioned my ultras, but again, I'm pretty broken after that. But yeah, the brokenness really is interesting, because at the end of the day, we're looking for some help. And if you're not broken in some way, then you probably don't need the help. What about you? I mean, you're writing a travel memoir too, like mine. So how much of your brokenness are you bringing to your book? Because I'm finding it pretty hard to put my brokenness out there.
Apparently I have no filter. So I'm not having as much difficulty in expressing some of what I've gone through, because it really, especially on the Camino Portuguese, in fact, because I had stone bruises on the bottom of my feet at one point. And
Remember, hobblestones, you called them.
Yes. It really dictated how I approached the Camino. And I mean, in positive and negative ways, it required me to slow down. And to, I think as a result, I ended up meeting some people. I ended up being in some places longer than I anticipated. I ended up, on the side of the road more often than I expected. And I think that's okay to say, because a lot of Camino books talk about, the journey in this rising arc and crescendoing to arrival in Compostela. And that's not the case for everyone, right? And everyone's Camino is different, but I think it has to be okay at times to say, had a bad day. And how you go about expressing that, what depth you share, for me, you and I are a little opposite. You said you're an introvert, and I'm probably your counterpoint in some of this. So I'm maybe overshare in my book. So looking forward to getting an edit on that.
But it's interesting. It's saying arriving in Santiago de Compostela again. I had spent decades building this moment up in my mind. How? And I think the film The Way has a lot to answer for, because they edit the movie, so it feels like you walk to the cathedral in a certain way, whereas the reality is you walk through this outskirts of this very busy Spanish city, and it's like, this is not how I imagined it. And actually, I was in a lot of pain by the end, and so I remember and there were so many tourists. I was like buffeted, and then I got to the square, the plaza, and I was like, I'm just going to take my selfie. And I was hot. It was really hot. So my selfie isn't even a good selfie. It's like not nice. I'm bright red. It's terrible. And then I was like, right, I'm done. I'm going to the hotel, going to lie down. And the moment of arrival, after so many years of thinking about it, was disappointing. I'm going to say it. It was disappointing. But the next day, and this is why it's so important to book extra time wherever you are going, because you might arrive like I did, tired, in pain, or really late or whatever. And what you need is more time for it to settle. And it's not just a couple of days in Santiago de Compostela. It's the time to settle afterwards. So the next day I got up, I taped my feet, I had some food, and then I went around the city without a backpack. And that's just, that's important. And then I went in the church, I went to mass, I had some nice food, I had churros and chocolate, which is always a good reward. And the day after, the couple of days I spent in the city afterwards really helped me. Canterbury as well. And also I spent an extra day I spent the night on Lindisfarne, Holy Island. So make sure, like people listening, that the good tip is schedule extra nights wherever you're going for the end, so that you don't have to arrive and then try and see everything before you jump on a plane or something. And also, as you say, sometimes our expectations are something, but the places where we feel spiritual or enjoy the journey are not necessarily the places that other people have, or that the books say you should, or whatever. Although both of us enjoyed Evensong at Canterbury Cathedral separately, we weren't there together, but similar time, and that is an expected moment of divine, and it was, wasn't it? You enjoyed it too.
I really did, and I appreciated your tip, actually, to, if you're going to Canterbury, whether you're walking as a pilgrim or visiting the cathedral, to attend Evensong. And you actually went to the Evensong practice, which was almost a private audience for you, because it happens before the choir pews are filled, and you get this opportunity to really be alone in the cathedral with this lifting music and, all of the history and experiences that have happened there in Canterbury. One of the things that you talked about in our last podcast was how you came into Canterbury as this bustling town and a pilgrim in a rucksack, and no one cared. No one was there with the trumpets, and there was no signage or parade saying you've done it. And Santiago is a bustling city as well, filled with many, many more pilgrims. I wonder how you found Compostela versus Canterbury.
Yeah, well, I think I was used to it by then, and I mean, and the reality is, we should come back to crossing to Holy Island, because you walk across the sand. It's like, oh, this is amazing. I'm having this moment, and then you carry on walking, and then it's muddy, and then your shoes get wet, or you're in bare feet, and then you have to clamber up this slope on the other side, and then you sit on this bench next to a road, and there's all these coaches going past, and then you walk into the village, and there's a coach park, and so this is the truth of every single arrival. Is there may well be these moments, and then there's the practicality of being a human in a place with loads of other humans.
So
And
I want to interject, Joe, because you just mentioned, and I just remember arriving in Lindisfarne. So I got my shoes back on and my pants legs pulled back down and my backpack on, and I was walking, along the highway, and there's this sign that says, Holy Island of Lindisfarne. I can't remember the signage exactly, but it's the welcome sign as cars are coming up to the car park. And I was walking, and these two bikers came up to me and they said, "Excuse me, would you mind taking our picture?" And I'm like, I am literally trying to get to the Abbey on my pilgrimage walk. Could I please step aside and take your picture? Of course. So, it's everyone experiences it differently. One of my favorite elements of Compostela, as you said, is taking the extra days, because experiencing that city and its pilgrimage heritage was really special for me. And that's something that Jack and I have planned as well, as an extra day in Compostela. But seeing the pilgrims arrive in the square and the variation, I don't think, if you're having a bad day, I think if you go there and see the range of emotions that take place for pilgrims that are arriving at Santiago de Compostela, it's hard to not get back into a space where you're open to caring and open for feeling for others, because so many people have such varied arrival experiences, and I loved watching the pilgrims arrive in Santiago.
Yeah, I was more interested in a beer, to be honest, by the time I got there. But I did want to say, what's so interesting is I went to the Pilgrims Mass, which is multiple times a day, and they announce the countries that the pilgrims have come from. So I went to the Mass, and definitely go to visit the church at a different time, because the cathedral is amazing. Although the monasterio, which is behind the church, the monasterio is amazing too. And I was there again alone, because everyone goes to the cathedral. But the experience of Mass was hilarious, because you mentioned the cathedral in Canterbury, where I was alone with the wonderful Latin psalms going up to the God. And yet the Pilgrims Mass, I was in the middle of a school trip. So I was surrounded by, 14, like probably kids the same age of your son, but when they're in a school group, like there were 40 of them, and they all sitting around, and they just would not shut up, and their teacher was trying to shut them up. And I was like, look, I'm trying to have my spiritual moment in the Mass, and it's just not happening for me. But again, it's like, this is the reality of being a pilgrim. It's snatching the moments, and when the moments happen, just experience those moments and be glad of them, because they may well just not be at the point that you expect. So yeah, I found that Mass to be quite hilarious. But as for people caring about your pilgrimage, what's great about this podcast is that people care about your pilgrimage. Like, you care more about my pilgrimage, and I care more about yours than my husband does, or like a load of my friends or my family. They're just like, yeah, don't really understand why you did that. No, oh, you're back, whatever,
Exactly.
Or being a writer. People don't care about your book either. Like, seriously, people don't care about these things. They're just getting on with their own life. And so the experience of pilgrimage is primarily for the pilgrim. And so you have to remember that on your arrival. You won't get the hat. You won't get that. Oh, you do. You get the hat. You get the t-shirt. I've got a pilgrim t-shirt. I've got on my wall here, I've got the badges. You've got to
get your badges.
Shell.
Absolutely.
You've got to get your scallop shell. You've got to get the things you've got to get. But you're the one who cares. It's your journey, your Camino, your way is one of the things that people talk about. But yeah, no one's going to celebrate it except for you. And then it's making something of it. Like, you're writing a book, I'm writing a book. People listening, you don't have to write a book, but
no, I didn't even set out to write a book or have a podcast.
Oh, you didn't?
No,
okay.
I did. I mean, I hope everyone listening reads the book, but I
Oh,
didn't set out
of
to write a
course.
book. I was so, I started the podcast because I met people along the Camino, and they were part of my Pilgrim family, right? We cared about each other. We were on a journey in our lives that paralleled one another. And so we had great empathy for one another as we met several times along the way. And after we all went home, we tried to stay in touch, but then went our separate ways. And as you said, during the pandemic, I lost touch with my Pilgrim family. So I said, what can I do that would make me feel more connected? I know I could talk to pilgrims. And so that's why I started the podcast. And I wanted to go on another journey in 2020 in June, and I couldn't. And so I said, well, I know I'll just start writing down all the things I loved about my pilgrimage walk in Spain and Portugal. And, that is where writing a book kind of started. My wife gave me a journal, and I've traveled the world with it. And she inscribed it because my wife is brilliant. Not only is she caring and supportive of all of these things that I'm doing and gorgeous and a great cook, but she's brilliant. She wrote in my journal, she said, write it down every single moment. And, to have the support of someone who says, I'm not on this journey with you, but I respect what you want to do or what you need to do. And she knew that there would come a time where I needed to reflect on it. And so that's where the book came from. But no, everybody doesn't need to write a book. No, nobody has to start a podcast. Nobody has to do any of those things, right? Some of it is just be in the moment. Capture it for your memory so that you can reflect on it when you need to. Because you mentioned, Joe, the moment you arrive is not always a moment of enlightenment. And we've kind of been talking about that. When I went into Rome this year, right? Rome is not an
Crazy
easy city to walk into.
No.
And then to walk into the Vatican, where there are, I arrived midday, which is obviously not the best time to arrive at the Vatican, but there were queues and queues and queues of, I don't know, maybe 10,000 people waiting to go into St. Peter's. And I will say, and we mentioned this, if you are a pilgrim and you're walking into St. Peter's, make sure you take your pilgrim passport, because that's the Rome equivalent of the Disney World Fast Pass, because you just bypass the line, you go straight to the front, and then in you go. But my moment in St. Peter's wasn't the arrival. Now, mine was special because in Santiago, in Rome, my family was there at the end of a long journey, and you just fall into their arms, and they give you that extra lift because you're excited to be with them again. But those moments that people build up don't always happen the minute of arrival. Sometimes they happen upon reflection. They happen weeks, months, or years later.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I was getting at is, like, you don't need to write a book, you don't need to do a podcast, but you should do something. So what you might have a journal, or you might have loads of photos. So I was talking to another podcaster, Holly Wharton. Her podcast is Into the Woods. Some people might enjoy that too. And we were talking about how it's too easy just to move on. Like, as soon as you come back from a pilgrimage, you put your washing in the washing machine. That's literally one of the first things that you'll do. You'll eat some random food. Then you'll start doing all the admin that you've missed, all the emails and all the banking and all that stuff that you've been away. And you can easily forget things. So even if you make a photo album, or maybe you print one of your photos and put it in up on the wall, or maybe you do buy that T-shirt from Santiago de Compostela and you put it in your drawer, and then when you go to the gym in 2 months' time, you pull out that T-shirt and you go, yeah, I remember that. And so it's these moments of remembrance, I think, are important in honoring the journey that we've been on, because life moves on so fast, doesn't it? And I as much as I will do more pilgrimages, I'm sure, I don't want them all to kind of mush together in my mind as these things. And that's why I wrote my book now. And it will be very interesting when yours comes out, because I just wanted to come back to something you said. Your wife said, write every single moment. Now, that is just not practical, because every single moment you're like, I am walking, and I walk with poles. So
I inferred that to mean every single meaningful moment.
But equally, a meaningful moment can be walking with poles across a muddy patch where you have a moment of thought. So you write that down later. But what I was going to ask you and talk a bit about is turning, because I have a journal, like a thick journal for every single walk. So that's 3 walks. I had about 100,000 words in my document for this book. And in the end, I threw a lot of it out, like most of it out, because what's the other thing interesting about pilgrimage? It's very repetitive. So you read your journal later, you're like, my feet hurt. I got really hungry today. My pack was too heavy. I'm really tired. And like you kind of say the same things every day. So when you look at your journal later, it's almost like every 10 pages, there's some actual deep and meaningful thoughts. So writing a book or doing your photo album or whatever later is a good way to kind of put together the moments out of the journey that matter. So how are you turning this journal with all your thoughts into a book? Like, how's the challenge there? Because mine turned out to be more thematic. So each chapter has a theme and a lesson, as opposed to I did this, then I did this.
Yeah, exactly the same, Joe. So followers on the podcast know that I started writing a book, Sacred Steps, and it has diverged. So there's Sacred Steps, which is very much a first-person pilgrimage experience book, and The Pilgrim's Table, which is a fictional book that'll be out in April. I feel like that was a plug. That'll be out in April 23rd, 2023. But The Pilgrim's Table, I think, is a book that I'm in love with, because it's given me the opportunity. And you know this, Joe Francis Penn has written, 35, 40 fictional books.
Like
It's a lot. And it gives you the opportunity to create in a creative space, but as a storyteller, right? Where I have been able to experience things, I can recreate them in a way that I think pilgrims enjoy, that relate stories that have been shared with me or that I've seen as I've gone across, that didn't have a place in my first person experiential journal. And so, The Pilgrim's Table is this book about it's 5 pilgrims that come together in an albergue at the end of the Camino de Santiago, and their common experiences sort of are shared over dinner that night. And I can't wait to share that with you. And I do want to thank Joe also, because she's been great in giving me some pointers and advice. But specifically on the journal side, I found the most comfortable for me way to present this was really, as you said, around some simple themes. And for me, they are faith, hope, and love. And so what are those elements of my pilgrimage where those have been, there are lessons learned, there are days, that brought forth these simple, even tropes of, this is how I was impacted in these 3 theme spaces. And it's been a bit of, as you said, people do pilgrimage for different reasons, but for me, it's been finding what are the questions I should be asking myself about these 3 elements that are so important in my life, and what are the answers that have been inspired by my experiences or my time to think about these things. So that's really the context for me. Let's just reset real quickly. Our guest today on the Sacred Steps podcast is Joe Francis Penn. Her new book out this week on Kickstarter is Pilgrimage: Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways.
The conversation continues momentarily. For information and links from the show, visit sacredstepspodcast.com. Know someone considering pilgrimage? Share this episode as a text from your device. To support the show, please leave a star rating in your podcast app. And now, the Sacred Steps Podcast continues.
I love the cover of this book, Joe. It's gorgeous. This is taken from one of your photos on the Way of St. Cuthbert.
It is. And actually, this is really interesting because I tested out a whole load of covers with my audience, and they chose one that was happy, sunny, blue skies, was not one of my pictures. And this picture that's on the cover, it was the least popular cover. But I just thought, and you understand this, the experience of pilgrimage for me was not happy, sunny, blue skies. It was actually pretty stormy. It was a physical challenge. So having a hill was really good. And then there's the element of faith. So the St. Cuthbert's Cross, the kind of the mountain, the stormy skies. Also, it's my photo. And I think with a travel memoir, when it's your experience, your own photos can be very powerful. And also, I mean, the other thing about writing a book, we should say, is that it's also for other people. Like, you can keep your journal as your own experience, but when you write a book, and as you said, I've written a lot of them, they are for other people to read. Mm-hmm. So I've actually got, in mine, I have a lot of practical tips, for example, about solo walking and gear and other stuff like that, food. And so I'm not quite so faith, hope and lovey as you are. But I still, I have a chapter on suffering and all of this different type of stuff, and my spiritual faith journey and all of that kind of thing. But I do think that our tips from doing these longer walks can also be useful for others. So, and I was going to comment on truth with a big T, a capital T, and truth with a little t, because this is important for you writing a novel as well. So truth with a big T is the things that you're going to write in fiction, potentially, that mean love, hope, and whatever. But you will be fictionalizing or concatenating or changing or exaggerating things that didn't happen that way in order to underscore the bigger truth of pilgrimage. And so this is really important to keep in mind when people are reading a travel memoir, is that the writer will have sometimes potentially changed the truth with a little t in order to make the truth with a big T the point. And I certainly, like, some of my journal entries that I include in the book are from different points, but I use them in chapters around certain elements to underscore the point that I hope will be useful for other pilgrims. So yeah, the experience of writing a book is almost a pilgrimage in itself.
I have certainly walked more miles trying to write this book than I have doing my pilgrimage. So,
but it will be worthwhile. It will be just as worthwhile in a very different way, and it will help others.
I think so. And I've already have 4 copies sold. So there's my mom, my brother, my
Yay
wife.
for mom.
Yeah, exactly. She doesn't listen to the podcast, but I digress. So I want to push a little bit because one of the things we've talked about is, as someone who's exploring the depths and spaces of faith in my walks, and you've talked a lot about finding spaces for spirituality. I wonder how, when you've had time to reflect on these 3+ pilgrimages that you've done, including writing about them, how has this series of walks and these journeys influenced or impacted your sense of spirituality?
I think there's a book in the Bible that I really like, Ecclesiastes. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible, and I have a master's in theology, so I have read the Bible a lot, even though I'm not a Christian anymore. But there's a quote that I actually put into the book, which is, and I wrote it down so I remember to get it right. It says, "As for humans, God tests them so they might know they are animals." And I just love that quote, because that to me is something I need to remember. My animal body is what walks a pilgrimage, and my spiritual mind and my intellectual mind is part of my physical body. And I feel like so much sometimes, like you and I, we're not physically in the same space. We can see each other, but we're connecting with our minds across this virtual space. And yet pilgrimage, it's such a physical journey. And also I was going through the female experience of midlife hormonal changes, which have a very animal effect. You're just completely out of control. You're like, what the hell is happening to me? And I have no control over this. And then, like we mentioned, the tides and all these things and the memento mori. So as I walked the Camino Portuguese, the Queen died. Queen Elizabeth II died in the UK. And as I walked every day that week, her pictures were on all the TVs that you walk past in the cafes and stuff. So they showed her whole life, her beautiful young woman who ascended the throne across the challenges of midlife to her old age, her husband dying and her dying. And it was like, I'm not a queen, but I'm another woman. And I see this woman's life and it will all end. And to me, that is so important to remember. And for my spiritual side, it's a sense of being part of this wonderful world and this amazing universe, whether you believe God created it or not, the sense of being an animal walking across the face of the world. And nothing else matters. Like, that's the thing. Nothing else matters. Now, of course, everything matters. Your family matters. My husband matters. My cats matter. my work matters to me. It all does matter. But when you're walking the pilgrimage and you have that simple life and the gratitude, I am so grateful for this cold beer or this shade of this tree or this hot shower when I'm really sweaty and it's gross and I just want to shower, or the painkillers. I'm so grateful for the pharmaceutical industry for my blister plasters and my painkillers and my Albarino and like all those things. It's that perspective. That's what it comes down to. It's those being able to hold on to that when everything feels overwhelming and you're just like, what is the point? And then you realize this is the point. The point is being an animal in the world.
Pilgrimage, your new book, which we'll link down in the show notes below, not only the Kickstarter campaign, but also Joe's website. So you can go to jfpenn.com/pilgrimage to link immediately to updates from her book. But this new book seems to be a bit of a more personal divergence from some of the things that you've written, Joe. Where does this book rank among those? I'm asking you to rank your children. Where does this book fall among
books
those?
Are not children when you get... Yeah, books are not children when you get past around 5. When you're like at 35, they're not your children, they're your employees. But no, in terms of, I've never written a memoir before. I've never written a travel book. Now, what's interesting is a lot of my books contain, like all my fiction is pretty much based on religious places. There are Santiago de Compostela is in my first novel, Stone of Fire.
All of these amazing cathedrals and churches and pilgrimage destinations are in so many of your books, and that's why they're so compelling. And but so this one is a different take.
Yeah, and I feel like this is very different. I don't intend at the moment to write another travel book, although who knows, I might write another kind of memoir. But it's a very personal book. It's a book of my heart. And when as a writer, as a professional commercial writer, I say it's a book of my heart, what that means is I don't know who's going to buy it. And the same with yours. I mean, let's face it, pilgrimage books are not exactly mainstream bestsellers.
There's not even a section called pilgrimage at your local bookshop. It's in travel or it's in spirituality or no one knows exactly where it belongs.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's for people who are called to pilgrimage. And I think there's enough of us, you and I are 2 of them, and the guest on your show and the people listening who understand what this means. And I hope that my book and your book will bring others into this experience so that it's much more than just a long walk. It's not just a long walk. It has much more meaning, and that you can visit these beautiful places and historical places. And as we've talked about all the great things you can see. But at the end of the day, this book is I put it in a completely different category. It basically is a sort of standalone experience, and I'm doing my best for it. That's why I'm doing a Kickstarter, is because I'm doing the hardback special edition. It has photos in, and I'm going to sign them and number them. And that's not something that authors can often do, because it's a lot of, obviously you have to pay the printer and all this kind of thing up front. And so I'm doing a Kickstarter, and yeah, hopefully it'll be useful. It will be out everywhere on all the usual stores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, blah, 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 after May 2023. But as you said, the link to the Kickstarter's there, but it will be out eventually everywhere else on all platforms. Also, I narrate the audiobook. So I don't know if you're doing this too, but audiobook narration, right?
I'm told that I have a face for radio, so maybe we'll do an audiobook.
You should definitely do one. You've got a lovely voice anyway, lovely voice.
Oh, you're too kind. Joe, let me ask you, thinking about, actually you just said something that reminded me, because you asked me long ago, what's the difference between a long walk and a pilgrimage? And that was one of the very first questions we had when we started talking a few years ago. But thinking about your journeys, thinking about these, putting on the backpack and lacing up your boots and going on these pilgrimage walks, you've done some amazing walks, and you've seen these beautiful destinations. You've had moments that touched your life and changed your outlook and gave you insights. I'm wondering, what are your next steps? We said that pilgrims often pick up the book and think about where they need to walk next. Is there an upcoming walk? Is there a destination in mind, or a place that you want to experience next?
It's so funny you asked that, because like I said, I had the goal of the Camino for decades, and now I have done it. Now, obviously, lots of people go and do it again, but I don't feel called to doing it again. I don't know. And I also almost feel like that's a good place to be. The good place to be is being open to different things. I don't know whether, like, for example, at the end of my book, Pilgrimage, I come home and I'm with my husband, and I feel like I need to walk with him next. And that will be very different, because he's a different kind of walker, and he doesn't like multi-day. He'll only do multi-day if there's a real good break in the middle after every couple of days. So I'm like, okay, well, that needs to be longer. And also he's interested in different things. He's Jewish. He's not particularly into the same areas that I am. So I think I will have a different goal. However, I say that you've had Andy Bull on this podcast, haven't you? The Walsingham. I've actually bought the Walsingham. I've got it right here. No, look, I'm going to do a little plug. I've got it right here.
There you go. Andy Bull's book, The London to Walsingham Camino. Andy's actually doing an organized trip that's coming up in March this year.
Oh, I don't do organized trips.
And there might be somebody on here who might be interested. So that's a March journey on the Walsingham Shrine Facebook page, and then he's going to be walking the entire route, London to Walsingham, with every day he's going to walk alongside one person to kind of experience it through their eyes. So Walsingham is definitely, a couple of years ago, you could have asked me.
What about you?
A couple of years ago, I would have been like, oh, Walsingham, I don't know it. And through Andy and through those who have written about the history and heritage of that journey, it's on the list. I don't know where it is on the list, but I would love to do it, because I love walking in the UK. I can get a bacon buddy almost anywhere. That's a delightful part of my experience. But I'd like to be up in Scotland. I'd like to be in Ireland, and walk the Irish way over in Dingle. And I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if I was going to do another Camino this year, because I just, I'd been doing sections of the Via Francigena, and I wanted to walk in France and walk in Switzerland. And Jack actually said, hey, I would like to do it with you this summer. And so that, when your kid says, I'd like to do something, especially when your teenager says they'd like to spend time with you, Dad.
Yeah.
we're gonna walk the Portuguese. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to see it through his eyes and to spend time at such a pivotal moment for both of us as I'm turning 50 and he's sort of moving from his childhood to his teenage developmental years. So who knows how badly I'm going to mess this kid up this summer. But right now, he and I are both looking forward to it. So, Joe, in the brief time we have left, let me ask, you mentioned that there's an audiobook. You mentioned there's a hardcover. But for those who are following along, can you share with us where we should be looking for Pilgrimage, and if you're going to be doing any more details of the book on your own podcasts?
Yeah, sure. So there's also a paperback and a workbook. I've got a workbook and an ebook. So it's pretty much available in every different format. So the Kickstarter is at jfpenn.com/pilgrimage. And that link will redirect to wherever it's sold later. So people can always go there. That page will have all the details about everything in the book. You'll be able to listen to a sample of me reading the audiobook. And I have had on my books and travel podcast, I've put a couple of chapters of Pilgrimage. The two chapters I actually think you resonate with you, which is the historical one, and also the places where you get a glimpse of the divine. I've actually put both of those on books and travel, so people can find that on their podcast app wherever they're listening. And yeah, I mean, I think if people are interested, it's definitely similar. I really think I'm looking forward to yours. I feel like they're sort of resonant together. And in fact, you've got a whole collection on this podcast of different books around pilgrimage. Yeah. And those of us who buy kind of Camino books, we buy them all, right? I mean, I have so many books. We're our own little industry.
I can't wait. I feel like I've been blessed to get to know you and to hear your experiences firsthand and to share those stories with our audience and to live those moments vicariously through you and to see through your lens. So I can't wait to read in more depth and detail Joe Francis Penn's new book, Pilgrimage, Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways. Joe, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Be well and stay safe. Buen camino, Joe.
Buen camino, Kevin.
This has been the Sacred Steps Podcast. To help other pilgrims find the show, please leave a star rating on your podcast app. For episode notes, links from the show, or to contact Kevin, visit our website at sacredstepspodcast.com. You can also join our Behind the Mic email list on the website. Before you go, tap subscribe so our future episodes are available to you automatically.